Serial killers don't become more famous, more notorious, more well-known than Ted Bundy. He was charismatic, and some would say handsome, smart, and he hid his evil dark side so well that even his closest friends and family were shocked when they discovered who he really was. Bundy was a rapist, a necrophiliac, and killed at least 20 women, probably more, and was executed by electric chair in 1989. This is 10-Minute Murder.
10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thanks for being here. Now, the brief and bingeable part and the 10-minute part, that's all going to be a lie today. So just so you know that up front, the subject of the show today, I've always found interesting, like many of you I'm sure have, but just assumed that I'd never be doing an episode devoted to Ted Bundy. It's been done, and done really well. However, in so many other cases you've heard here on 10-Minute Murder, his name continues to pop up. He's notorious in the world of true crime, and since this show started a little more than a year ago, I've steadily gotten requests to give Ted Bundy the 10-minute murder treatment. And honestly, there's no way possible to cover it in 10 minutes and also be interesting while covering the main points. So I basically just told myself I'd never be doing an episode on Ted Bundy, as interesting as it is. Then someone emailed me a few weeks ago and asked about it, and I explained, as I usually do, that it's too involved, there are too many details, and there's so much essential information that would make it impossible. They responded very politely, reminding me that I did episodes about the Manson family. Those were longer episodes and covered all the vital information. And to be completely honest with you, those are some of the most listened to episodes of this podcast. So, here we are with Ted Bundy. This first part will be the early life of Ted, how he grew up, how he was as a teen, relationships, and how he had two completely different faces. In part 2, we'll pick up with his murders, which officially began in 1971, but there is speculation that you'll hear about suggesting that it may have started much, much sooner. Ann Rule, a biographer, wrote a book about Ted Bundy and considered him at one time to be a close friend before she knew who he really was. She said this about him: Ted's a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. In the 1970s, Theodore Robert Bundy was a raping, murdering, manipulative monster. But as you well know, in 99.9% of cases, serial killers don't just flip a switch and become the way they are. They usually simmer in an environment of dysfunction, addiction, and abuse first. What makes Bundy's story so interesting is that it was a little different from the normal future serial killer. Mostly. There was some dysfunction, but not on the level that you would normally see. Ted's mother, Louise, was 22 years old and unmarried when she gave birth to him. It's way less of a big deal now, but in 1946, people talked, openly. Listed on his birth certificate where his biological father's name should be, it says unknown. There's also been a rumor and speculation about who it could be, including a man named Lloyd Marshall, who was an Air Force veteran and Penn State grad. Another guy named Jack Worthington, according to some, is his father, including Louise, who said that he seduced her. There were also whispers that Ted's real father could be his own grandfather. I feel like if Maury Povich had his show back in the 40s, we could have gotten to the bottom of this. But since it was unknown, the family tried to hide the illegitimacy. Louise gave birth at a home for unwed mothers in Vermont, and then took Ted to Philadelphia, where his grandparents adopted him. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. He eventually discovered the truth after he says a cousin showed him his birth certificate. To other people, he claimed that he found his birth certificate on his own, but telling conflicting stories would become normal and instinctive behavior for Ted Bundy. For the rest of his life, he held a resentment toward his mother for lying to him, and never talking to him about his real father. There were times when Ted spoke fondly of his grandparents, especially his grandfather. He said that he identified and respected him. Other family members weren't quite so doting on the grandfather, saying that he was a tyrannical bully who was a bigot. He hated blacks, Italians, Catholics, and Jews. He beat his wife and the family dog and swung neighborhood cats by their tails. He once threw Louise's younger sister, Julia, down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He sometimes spoke aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. His grandmother, on the other hand, was timid and battled depression. She underwent electroconvulsive therapy for treatment and was afraid to leave the house. She later told a story about 3-year-old Ted Bundy that was disturbing. She had fallen asleep during the day when Ted was there. She woke up from her nap to find herself surrounded by all the knives in the kitchen, and Ted was standing there, smiling at her. This could be noted as a harmless story, even funny, if we didn't already know what the child would grow up to become. In 1950, Louise and Ted moved to Tacoma, Washington to live with cousins there. The next year, Louise met Johnny Bundy at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First United Methodist Church. A year later, they married, and he formally adopted Ted. Louise and Johnny had 4 children together, and he tried to involve Ted in as many of the family activities as he could, like taking camping trips. Ted was distant and didn't want to have too much to do with his stepfather, telling his girlfriend at the time that Johnny wasn't very bright and didn't make much money. Growing up as a teen in Tacoma, Ted would wander the neighborhood, picking through the trash, searching for things that interested him. Specifically, what interested him was old detective magazines, crime novels, or anything that involved sexual violence. He especially liked the ones where there was an illustration of a maimed or dead body. Ted started drinking alcohol and progressed to drunkenly sneaking around, looking through windows with the curtains pulled back. He watched women undress, getting ready for bed or taking a late-night bath. While skeevy Ted was peeping through windows, he thought nothing of stealing anything nearby that he thought could be of use to him or valuable.
Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
That's the question of the hour, and one that not only people much more intelligent than I have been working on for years, but one that I've been working on for years and trying to understand. Is there enough time to explain it all? I don't know. I think I understand it, though. Understand what happened to me, to the extent that I can see how certain feelings and ideas developed in me to the point where I began to act out on them. Certain very violent and very destructive feelings.
All right, let's go back then to those roots. First of all, you, as I understand it, were raised in what you consider to have been a healthy home.
Absolutely.
You were not physically abused. You were not sexually abused. You were not emotionally abused.
No way. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole situation, is because I grew up in a wonderful home with 2 dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. A home where we as children were the focus of my parents' lives, where we regularly attended church, 2 Christian parents who did not drink, they did not smoke, there was no gambling, there was no physical abuse or fighting in the home. I'm not saying this was Leave It to Beaver.
It wasn't a perfect home.
Well, no, I don't know that such a home exists, but it was a fine, solid Christian home, and nobody, I hope no one will try to take the easy way out and to try to blame or otherwise accuse my family of contributing to this, because I know, and I'm trying to tell you as honestly as I know what happened, and I think this is a message I want to get across. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, or the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. And this also included such things as, let's say, detective magazines and more hardcore.
Those that involve violence. Then.
Yes. And and this is something I think I want to emphasize is the most damaging kinds of pornography. Again, I'm talking from personal experience. Hard, real, personal experience. The most damaging kinds of pornography are those that involve violence and sexual violence, because the wedding of those two forces, as I know only too well, brings about behavior that is just too terrible to describe.
Now, walk me through that. What was going on in your mind at that time?
Okay, before we go any further, I think it's important to me, and that people believe what I'm saying, to tell you that I'm not blaming pornography and not saying that it caused me to go out and do certain things. And I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies, didn't it?
Well, in the beginning it fuels this kind of thought process. Then at a certain time it's instrumental in what I would say crystallizing it, making it into something which is almost like a separate entity inside. And at that point you're at the verge, or I was at the verge of acting out on these kinds of thoughts.
Now I really want to understand that. You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you made or printed and video or film photos,
magazines, what have you.
And then there was the urge to take that little step or big step over to a physical event.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
How long did you stay at that point before you actually assaulted someone?
Well, yeah, you see, that is a very delicate point in my own development, and we're talking about having reached the point or a gray area that surrounded that point over a course
you don't remember
of years.
How long that
was? I would say a couple of years. And what I was dealing with there were very strong inhibitions against criminal behavior or violent behavior that had been conditioned into me, bred into me in my environment, in my neighborhood, in my church, in my school. Things which said, no, this is wrong. Even to think of it is wrong, but certainly to do it is wrong. And I'm on that edge, and you might say the last vestiges of restraint. The barriers to actually doing something were being tested constantly and assailed through the kind of fantasy life that was fueled largely by pornography.
After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a classmate named Stephanie Brooks. In early 1968, he dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as Rockefeller's delegate. Not long after he returned, his girlfriend ended their relationship, saying she was frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. The breakup was a huge blow for Ted, and he didn't take it very well. He decided to leave the area altogether and traveled to Colorado, then Arkansas to visit family, and then on to Philadelphia. He even enrolled for a semester at Temple University. By the fall of 1969, Ted was back in Washington and met a divorcee named Elizabeth and her daughter Molly. This is the same Elizabeth that he would be linked to off and on through at least 1976. Ted and Liz met at a local bar where she took him home that night, if you know what I'm saying. Which she says was super uncommon for her, but she had a good feeling about Ted. He had a way of making people feel comfortable around him. He was charming, good-looking, and smart. He only ever showed his true face to his victims. A refocused Ted Bundy re-enrolled at UW, majoring in psychology, of all things. His professors spoke highly of him, and the other students liked him. In 1971, he took a job at a suicide hotline crisis center in Seattle. It was there that he met and worked with Ann Rule, who would later write a pretty fantastic book about Bundy. In the book, called The Stranger Beside Me, she described him as kind and empathetic. After graduating in 1972, Bundy joined the Governor Evans re-election campaign. He used his skills to infiltrate the opponent's party, posing as a college student, recording speeches that he would take back to the Governor Evans teams for analysis. Nowadays, there's no need for all that secret spy stuff just to record speeches. You can just watch it for yourself because most of them are streamed live. But the Evans campaign loved the work that Ted had done for them so much that after the governor was re-elected, he was given a job as an assistant to Ross Davis, the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis said of Ted, he was smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. In 1973, Bundy wanted to attend law school, but his LSAT scores were not that great. Fortunately for Ted, he had the ability to get strong letters of recommendation from some pretty important people. Governor Evans, Davis, and several of the UW professors all wrote letters for him, and it worked. He received offers to attend in several places and decided on Puget Sound Law School, which is now called Seattle University School of Law. While there, he reconnected with his old girlfriend, Stephanie Brooks. She was impressed by his transformation into this serious and dedicated professional, seemingly on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. Ted continued to date Liz, and neither knew about the other. Things with Stephanie got a little more serious, and she would fly to Seattle several times to spend some time with Ted. He introduced her to his boss, called her his fiancée to him. They weren't actually engaged, but the two had discussed it. All the while, he's still spending time with Liz and her daughter Molly. In 1974, Bundy broke off all contact with Stephanie, abruptly. She tried to call over and over, but he wouldn't answer. She wrote letters that he did not return. Eventually, after a month of this, Ted did answer one of the phone calls. She basically asked Ted what was going on, and he replied, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and then hung up. She never heard from Ted again. Later, he explained his actions in an interview, saying, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." Stephanie, in retrospect, thought that he had deliberately planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance, as vengeance for the breakup she initiated in 1968. By this point, Bundy had started skipping law school classes, eventually not even bothering to show up at all. He had a new interest taking up his time. Young women were beginning to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. That's the end of part one of Ted Bundy. In the next part, you'll hear about what was happening to all the women that were disappearing. There's also a speculation that you'll hear about suggesting that Ted Bundy, the serial killer, may have started much, much sooner in life, just barely into his teenage years. Thanks for listening to 10 Minute Murder. Have a good night.